Amanda Tyler, thank you so very, very much for being with us, spending a bit of your time with us today. Before we dive into the topic of Christian nationalism, can you tell us just a bit about yourself, what BJC is, and how you got involved with this whole issue of Christian nationalism?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Pastor Tim, for having me and for this wonderful series. So I'm Amanda Tyler. I am a lifelong Baptist Christian, originally from Austin, Texas, but I've spent a good part of my life in Washington, D.C., first as a college student and then also working for a member of Congress and most recently working for this organization that I lead, BJC, or Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. I am a lawyer by training, and I have spent time practicing law and clerking for a judge and working for a member of Congress, and now in my role leading this education and advocacy nonprofit. So a little bit about BJC, because I imagine your congregation might be learning about us for the first time.
Right.
So we are an 86-year-old advocacy and education organization. We come from the Baptist perspective and the Baptist tradition. Something about Baptists is that there are a lot of different kinds of Baptists. And, BJC stands for Baptist Joint Committee. The joint is because we bring together a number of different kinds of Baptists, all committed to defending religious freedom for everyone. So currently we are supported by 15 different Baptist denominational bodies. I think a question that often comes up is, well, are you Southern Baptist? I will say that the Southern Baptist Convention is not one of those 15 bodies, although they were at one point, and that's conversation for probably a whole nother, conversations that we might have. But that I think it's important to recognize the diversity of Baptist perspectives, and something that brings us all together across lines of theological difference and racial difference and geographic difference, and even in the Baptist family, is this commitment to religious freedom for all. And in our work, we're carrying on more than 400 years of commitment from Baptists standing up for everyone's religious freedom. And actually, one of the founders of the Baptist movement, Thomas Helwys, wrote what is considered to be the first defense of universal religious freedom in the English language back in the early 17th century. And he shared that with King James I of England at the time, and he was imprisoned for advocating for religious freedom in that experience. And other Baptists who defended everyone's religious freedom back in those early days were often persecuted for their views. So not just Thomas Helwys, but Roger Williams and some of the other colonial Baptists, because they were always outside the established religion, were persecuted for their views. And so it is in that line of dissenters and in that line of standing up for everyone's religious freedom rights and against the establishment of religion by government that the BJC comes to our work today. And then over the last several years, I would say, we have also seen our work defending religious freedom as needing to understand and call out Christian nationalism. And it is in that frame of seeing this ideology of Christian nationalism as a direct threat to religious freedom for all that inspired us now more than 3 years ago, working with a number of different ecumenical groups, including ELCA, to launch an initiative called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So that's an initiative that you can learn so much more about at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. And if you're interested in some of the other advocacy work that BJC does, including work that we do at the U.S. Supreme Court and with Congress, you can learn about that at bjconline.org.
There's so many fascinating things we could pick up on just from that just introduction. But let's jump into how you would define Christian nationalism. What do we mean by that? We're hearing it a lot lately. There's some pushback sometimes, but there are increasingly politicians, particularly on the right side of things, that are saying we need to embrace that name. What is Christian nationalism?
That's the absolute right place to start because I think we need to have a common understanding of what we're talking about. So, the definition I would offer of Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge our identities of Americans and Christians. So, right off the bat, you can see that I'm talking about Christian nationalism in an American context,
Yes.
though Christian nationalism is not unique to the United States. And also religious nationalism is a thing. It doesn't have to be Christian to be so, but to really show where our focus is, it really is talking about American Christian nationalism. So it suggests that to be a true American, that one has to be a Christian, and specifically a certain kind of Christian that embraces, certain moral positions or
Mm-hmm.
political positions on things, as well as in most situations, be a white Christian. And that's where
Okay.
this term white Christian nationalism comes out. So I think in defining Christian nationalism, it's often important to distinguish what it's not. So one thing to discuss is Christian nationalism the same as Christianity? And I would say no, but with some caveats. So, first off, Christian nationalism is, as I defined it, a political ideology and a cultural framework. Christianity, on the other hand, is a religion. So right off the bat, that is one difference. But one of the confusing aspects of this and how they can be merged is because Christian nationalism uses the symbols and the language of
Mm-hmm.
Christianity to buttress the ideology. And so we have confusion there. The other aspect is that Christian nationalism is a pervasive ideology and cultural framework, and one that is pretty long-standing in the
Mm-hmm.
American context. It has so impacted American Christianity and some Christian communities that it can be difficult to extricate them sometimes. And so I don't think it's accurate. I think it would be convenient and preferable to say that Christian nationalism has nothing to do with Christianity, but I don't think that that's entirely accurate. And part of our mission at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is for communities to be self-reflective about how their own congregations or communities or even individual theologies have been impacted by Christian nationalism, and to work to dismantle it first in their own communities and their own theologies before trying to work in the greater culture. So it's not something of finger pointing, oh, I'm just, concerned about the Christian nationalists over there, and not thinking about how the ideology itself has seeped into American life. In that way, I think it's useful to think about Christian nationalism in some ways like we think about racism, that we can't just say, okay, there's a racist and there's someone who's not a racist, but that
Mm-hmm.
racism as an ideology is so pervasive in the American context that we are all impacted in some way. And it's more a question of how much we embrace or fight against it that is important, rather than trying to label into different camps. One other distinguishing aspect of Christian nationalism, as we're talking about definitions, is patriotism versus
Mm-hmm.
nationalism.
Right.
So I do think there's a difference. I consider myself a patriot. I think that patriotism is best defined as love of country.
Mm-hmm.
Christian nationalism, on the other hand, and nationalism in general, is a kind of allegiance to country that demands allegiance above everything else, including our allegiance to Jesus or any other religious
That's good.
conviction that we have. And so a question, again, to ask ourselves is my patriotism causing me to sacrifice my religious convictions? If so, it's no longer patriotism, it's nationalism. And that's something to fight against. But we can be both faithful Christians and patriotic Americans without embracing Christian nationalism.
So let's go at this again now, but go at it from the perspective of why Christian nationalism can be dangerous in
Yeah.
our culture.
Yeah. So I think it's dangerous in a number of ways. One, and I think most urgently and most alarmingly, is it can actually result in physical violence and in deadly violence. And I want to start because in the hands of violent extremists, Christian nationalism turns deadly, and we
Hmm.
know this sadly, tragically from experience, from what we've seen. We saw it at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston in 2015. We saw it at the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018. We saw it very recently, earlier this year, in Buffalo at the Top Supermarket, where again, violent extremists have used the ideology of Christian nationalism in ways that have inspired their attacks. We also, and this is work that BJC did in partnership with a group called the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we also have seen how Christian nationalism was at play in the January 6th insurrection and attack at the Capitol. Again, not that Christian nationalism alone can explain what happened on January 6th, but we have to understand how that ideology helped unite disparate actors and also cause them to, justify or seek to justify or bolster their indefensible actions in attacking democracy itself. So that's one category. Second
Hmm.
category is I think that Christian nationalism as an ideology directly attacks foundational values of religious freedom for all. The idea that our belonging in American society does not depend on how we worship or what we believe or how we identify religiously, that we are all equal citizens and have equal belonging in our society. That is a promise of the First Amendment. That is an American distinctive that I believe we can be proud of, is a long history of at least holding that as an ideal. And Christian nationalism directly attacks it. It says that Christians have a special sense of belonging, that the
Hmm.
country has been inspired by God directly, and that it is the government's job to support Christian values and to support Christian laws, and that Christianity demands a privileged place in society. This view, this mythology of a quote unquote Christian nation is ahistorical and is also directly at odds with the text of the Constitution itself.
Hmm.
But how that impacts religious freedom on the ground today can be dangerous. I've pointed to some deadly examples, but it's
Right.
dangerous in the way that it creates a second class system of citizens based on religion that is un American. And finally, my third category, and there may be more, but I kind of think about it in these buckets, but Christian nationalism is dangerous to Christianity itself. And that's because the values and teachings of Christian nationalism directly go against the commandments of Jesus. Of course, our first commandment to love God above everyone else. Christian nationalism puts the nation above God or confuses religious and
Hmm.
political authorities in ways that lead to idolatry. Christian nationalism also leads us to violate the second commandment, to love our neighbors as ourselves. We're taught to love everyone regardless of our religious views or any other type of category that we as humans might put on our neighbors, and so Christian nationalism imposes that level of difference and different treatment that causes us to sin in that way as well. And in the broader community, this confusion between Christian nationalism and Christianity, I think, also presents dangers to a faithful Christian witness in the broader community. It confuses our neighbors who aren't Christians about what exactly is Christianity, or is it really this Christian nationalism? And I
Right.
think that poses problems for the vitality and the authenticity of our faith in the broader culture.
It sounds in a way like those who want to embrace Christian nationalism believe then that the work of the country is to carry out the work of the church, in a sense. And I think what's so fascinating about particularly the background that you come from was that it was our Baptist friends who early on, when this country was founded, said, no, that's not the country we want. We want everyone to worship as they please without the government imposing religion on other people or denying how people want to worship together. And that's what makes Christian nationalism sort of head scratcher, I think, in some ways. I think as Christians, we want to worship the way we want. But there's a sense of some that say, yeah, but we don't want others to worship the way they want. And that's what becomes dangerous.
Yeah, and I think it's that freedom that is supported by the way that we've protected religious freedom historically in this country by separating the institutions of religion and government, by saying that the government is uniquely ill-qualified to be involved in religious matters, and vice versa, that it's not the job of the church to direct the government, that these two very important institutions in our society have different roles and shouldn't be overly involved in each other's direct business. Now, all of this is not to say that people of faith don't have a role in the public square, don't have an advocacy role in being involved in their communities, in public policy. I think that's an important distinction that often gets merged. Everyone has an equal right to engage constructively in the public square and to bring their full selves into the public square. But we don't have a right to demand that our laws reflect our particular religious views or to impose those religious teachings on our neighbors, right? That we protect everyone's freedom by having a secular government that passes secular laws that apply to everyone, that leaves all of us free to practice religion as we see fit, or as increasing numbers of our neighbors choose, not to practice religion at all, and that we are all equal citizens regardless of what choice we are freely making. And that's a theological point that has long been important to a number of different people, and particularly to Baptists, that freedom of choice to choose to have a relationship with God or to choose not to have a relationship with God is encumbered when the government gets involved. That if the government is pushing religion or is denigrating religion, frankly, that gets involved with that freedom of choice, and that religion is only authentic when it's freely chosen by the believer.
So part of the challenge when we use, and you mentioned this with Christian nationalism, it's a particular kind of Christianity. I often ask people, all right, if we're a Christian nation, what kind of Christian nation?
Right.
If you're a Lutheran, you may not want to be in a country that's a Baptist Christian nation. And if you're a Baptist, you may not want to be an Episcopalian country or Pentecostal, whatever it might be. Whose Christianity determines what makes us a Christian nation. But your argument is that there is sort of a specific understanding of Christianity that shapes this political viewpoint. Am I hearing you correctly?
That's right. And I would say that the Christian and Christian nationalism is less about theology or religion and more about identity.
Yeah.
I would point to sociologists of religion, Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, who have written some great books and articles on this topic and who have studied it from a sociological perspective to show that those who most embrace Christian nationalism as an ideology and cultural framework, how predictive that is of their positions on political issues. And so it is really these positions on political issues such as, immigration policy, for instance, or refugees, or gun control, to name another current issue, that it's more those political issues that are driving the conversation and this identity of Christian than any particular theology or denomination or perspective that we could readily point to. And that's another way, I think, an important way to distinguish Christian nationalism as an ideology versus Christianity as a religion, or the many different variations of Christianity that we know exist both in this country and around the world.
Yeah. It has seemingly led Christians, not just now, but throughout history, to have to do a lot of mental gymnastics in their faith to embrace their political party if they believe their political party or their politician is a Christian person, but their values, their lifestyle is anything but. And that's been part of the challenge. We see it really starkly now. This party is godless and this party is the Christian party. And that can cause some real danger in terms of putting sort of, and you've mentioned this earlier, putting our faith in the background and our politics becomes sort of our Lord and Savior over Jesus.
Yeah, and the idea that any political party or any candidate can fully encompass and match up with our theology is a fallacy from the beginning, and it leads us astray from, what I believe the work of a Christian witness in the churches in our society, and that is, of course, to care for our neighbor, to show love for our neighbor, but also when required to hold our political leaders to account.
Mm-hmm.
And when any church or faith community gets too closely aligned with any political party or candidate, when that distance closes and we lack that separation, we aren't able to offer that prophetic voice into the public square with the same kind of force that we would have if we had maintained that healthy separation. That separation between our institutions is really good for both the church and the state.
So you mentioned just briefly, and we're going to wrap up here, some ways for us to have a positive influence on the country that we love, that it's good to love our country. And when you love a country, that means you also recognize when it's not doing so well and you love it enough to say, hey, we've got to be better than this. What are some practical tips that you would give to people to say, these are some ways that you can be involved right now in shaping and influencing the politics happening in your local community, for example?
Yeah. Well, first, I would absolutely refer people to ChristiansAgainstChristianNationalism.org. The centerpiece of our project is a statement of principles, not a statement of belief, because there is no one statement of belief that would unify the kind of diversity of Christians that we have involved in this project, but rather a statement of principles that can unite us across our differences. And so one would invite anyone who would like to publicly join us as a signer of this statement of principles, but two, to use these ideas and these principles to be advocates in your community. The very first of the unifying principles is that people of all faiths and none have a right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. And so to both take a place and a role in the public square to advocate, but to advocate for our neighbors, to push back against Christian nationalism when we see it at our local school board or in our city council, or in other places, even in places where it's not the government involved necessarily, but when you're hearing people in your social circles or in your social media networks repeating some of these myths of a Christian nation, furthering this idea that one has to be a Christian to really belong here, to push back against that and to offer a Christian witness, a different Christian voice into that conversation space. And at ChristiansAgainstChristianNationalism.org, we have a number of resources to help you do that. We have some one-pagers, we have webinars, we have a curriculum that congregations or small groups can use for conversation in ways that I think can, again, being self-critical first and really being self-reflective about how Christian nationalism has impacted our own theology and ideology, but then also using that as a way to have conversations, difficult conversations sometimes in our broader communities, and to offer what I think is a really needed voice and Christian witness in this critical time.
What do you think when we think about Christian nationalism? One of the things that you mentioned was it's one of the ways we try to give ourselves an identity. What is the identity from your perspective? This is just you now. What is the identity of those of us living in the United States of America? This is our country. We're diverse. We worship differently. We think differently. If it's not Christianity that gives us our identity, what gives us our identity from Amanda's perspective?
From my perspective, it's this commitment to protecting everyone's religious freedom. This is part of what it means to be an American, that one doesn't have to be of a given faith to have equal citizenship here. And that is something that no matter what we believe, we can all get behind. And that can serve as a unifier for us and not as a divisive force. So I think that what kind of defines Americans is our diversity, is the fact
Mm-hmm.
that we all come to the American experience in a different way, right? And so I think if we embrace that pluralism and understand that that distinctive unites us, maybe somewhat counterintuitively,
Mm-hmm.
that our diversity is what unites us, then I think that we have such promise for a really vibrant American future that could lead us away from this current polarization
Yeah.
that's polarizing in ways that often are following this mythical idea of what it means to be an American. And I think we can be inspired in many ways about what could be possible if we were to embrace that pluralism as a positive and not a negative.
Yeah. Well, the website bjconline.org has some great resources on this and others, and you probably have the link there too to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I listened to some podcasts on this topic, which were really excellent, and I just want to thank you as one Christian pastor for the great work that you and your team have been doing on this topic. You've kind of been all over the place. I know you've been the sort of the face of this discussion on a lot of news networks and so on, and you've done such a great job of just articulating who we are as Christian people. And so thank you for that, and thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you. And I'm eager to continue our work together.
Thanks.